So now I'll introduce Jennifer or Dr. Veilleux here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Again, as the talk goes on, you can use that Q&A function to send questions. So Dr. Jennifer Veilleux is an associate professor of clinical psychology. Welcome, by the way, at the University of Arkansas. She's been funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the John Templeton Foundation. She studies emotion and self-regulation, often in the context of risk behaviors such as cigarette smoking and binge eating. Lately, she's focused on studying the stress tolerance and beliefs about emotion and how both of these processes influence people's decisions during emotional situations. The title of her talk today is The Momentary Relationships Between Perceived Momentary Willpower, for a little bit about that, and affect and distress intolerance. Her collaborators are Kayla D. Skinner, Danielle E. Baker, and Caitlin D. Chamberlain. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Veilleux, take it away.
All right. Hello.
You should be able to share your screen.
I'm working on it.
There.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for having me. I'm going to be talking about momentary relationships between willpower, affect, and distress intolerance today. So I'm delighted to go after Roy Baumeister, who's of course an expert in willpower and self-control, and Hoffman, his collaborator. I've also done a lot of work kind of following in his footsteps. So today I'm talking about willpower, which is often synonymously used for self-control. And here we're talking about the ability to resist temptation, to pursue long-term goals over short-term hedonic pleasures. So historically, willpower has been studied from kind of two angles. One is more of a personality angle, and this is about, is willpower the quality of a person, something one has? So a graduate student even yesterday was talking to me about being annoyed with people who do not have a lot of willpower, kind of like this guy maybe. So we can think about willpower as a trait people vary on. It's typically measured with self-report scales. And we can also, and this is the personality psychology tradition, we can also think about willpower as a state. Historically, this has been primarily studied in social psychology, lab-based tasks, where we look to see if self-control kind of varies based on contextual features. And this is usually assessed using kind of tasks like a Stroop task, where it takes self-control to resist saying the name of the word, instead having to report on the color that the word is printed in. There's a lot of self-control tasks. So these two questions, the sort of trait-based version of self-control and state-based version of self-control, both super important. But I've sort of had a slightly different question, which is, as a clinical psychologist, I'm interested in kind of what happens in people's minds and how those influence their behavior. So I was interested in asking the question of if people can self-report on their available willpower in a given moment. So obviously the answer to this question is yes, they can. You ask people to do something and they'll be able to report it. But that's a slightly different question than whether self-reported momentary willpower is psychologically meaningful. And I thought on the front end that yes, it would be psychologically meaningful. This is basically a self-efficacy appraisal. So if someone is asking themselves, am I capable of exerting self-control right now? Can I look inside myself and say, do I have willpower right now? How much do I have? How much kind of juice do I have for self-control related tasks? So I thought this would be meaningful because self-efficacy matters, particularly when related to self-control. When people believe they can do something, they're more likely to try. So I've spent a good portion of my career studying cigarette use and eating behavior and other types of kind of risk behaviors. And when people feel like they can do it, when they can quit, they're going to be more likely to do it. If they feel like they can't, they just give in. So I do think that there's some meaning in getting people's self-perceptions of their self-efficacy. And of course, this is a really useful question to ask with EMA because you can get at people's willpower over time in different situations. So that begs the question then, okay, so under what situations would we likely to see contextual fluctuations in willpower? There's been plenty of work showing that willpower isn't the same as tiredness or hunger, but it does likely go along with those things. We might also expect to see people have less willpower maybe when they're alone or when they're stressed. But the situation that I'm most interested in is thinking about affect. So we would expect that when people are feeling good, they would feel more willpower, and when people are feeling bad, they will feel less willpower. And as a side note, I was a theater major in college, and dividing up that comedy tragedy mask made me very happy. Okay. So we would expect this relationship between willpower and affect, in part because that has been found looking at momentary impulsivity. So when we look at impulsivity via EMA, we find, or they find, I didn't do this work, people have found that when people feel worse, they feel more negative affect and less positive affect, they tend to report greater momentary impulsivity. So I would expect that willpower would have this same relationship, but I do expect that willpower is likely different than impulsivity. So willpower is a broader construct than impulsivity in a lot of ways. In large part, there's a couple of reasons I'm going to kind of focus on this one today, that willpower, or impulsivity, I'm sorry, is generally thought of as a behavioral thing. When someone's impulsive, they act impulsively. They do something impulsive. They binge eat, they self-injure. On a more kind of common basis, they eat 3 cookies instead of 1, or they snap at their partner, right? Impulsivity is about behavior. But self-control and willpower is needed for stuff that's not just behavioral. So willpower is important and self-control is important for internal regulatory capacities. So I am particularly interested in emotion and emotion regulation, so I'm going to focus on that here. There's other things that we need to regulate, maybe working memory, etc. But willpower is needed for, say, cognitive reappraisal, which is a very well-known and effective emotion regulation strategy where people need to reframe the situation to be able to change their emotion. So willpower might be used for that because it's an effortful process, particularly when you're not used to doing it. Willpower is also probably relevant for distress tolerance. So distress tolerance is one of the main things that I've been studying these days, and what is that? So distress tolerance is the ability to withstand aversive internal states. Could be physical pain, could be any variety of negative emotion, frustration, uncertainty, etc. So distress intolerance or lack of tolerance would be difficulty withstanding, and it tends to associate with escape behaviors or avoidance behaviors and impulsive behaviors as sort of a potential outcome. But it is also an internal process, right? We have to choose to withstand the emotion and stay in that momentary situation. We could choose to escape kind of inside our own heads. There wouldn't be any behavior there. So I think that willpower is likely associated with distress intolerance. So I predicted that that would be both concurrent and predictive into the future. So I would expect that when people experience lower willpower, they would also feel less able to tolerate their negative emotions. I would also expect a prospective prediction where when someone feels less capable of self-control in the moment, lower momentary willpower, that would be a vulnerability factor for having less distress tolerance in the subsequent kind of prompt or in a little bit. I would expect that because willpower as a broader construct, when someone feels generally less capable of exerting self-control and then they encounter a negative situation, that they would then have less ability to tolerate that second situation. But I wouldn't necessarily expect that the more narrow distress intolerance construct, when somebody feels lower distress intolerance, that would predict greater deficits in willpower. So those were essentially the predictions that went into this set of studies. That I predicted that momentary willpower would vary over time and across contexts. So there's a little bit of construct validity piece here of trying to see if willpower goes along with the things that it should, like more tired or before smoking and eating. And that affective context is important so that people will report higher willpower alongside higher positive affect and lower negative affect. We also predicted that lower willpower would be associated with distress intolerance reported at the same time, and that willpower would predict distress tolerance in the subsequent session. So to look at these, we did 3 EMA studies, and these had 4 different samples. So I'm going to look at them by sample, these 4 groups, but the studies matter for measurement purposes, and there were 3 studies. So study 1 had college students who were recruited to be either high or low in features of borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is a pretty pervasive disorder. People with features of borderline personality pathology tend to have feel emotions very strongly, have a lot of trouble regulating their emotions, tend to act very impulsively, and have a lot of interpersonal issues. So we've got this sort of control group of people with no borderline features, and then the borderline group. Study 2 was cigarette smokers, and study 3 was chronic dieters, people who have tried to diet and sort of failed, so chronic failed dieters who are at risk for eating pathology. So in all 3 of these studies, they had 1 week of EMA, 7 times a day with random prompts, and some event-based prompts I'll talk about in a minute. Now, I want to be clear that the results I'm going to show you are secondary data analysis. None of these studies were designed specifically to look at willpower, but sort of a planned secondary data analysis, because the willpower measures were put in each study intentionally with the idea that we would look at them kind of after we looked at the kind of initial focus of the study. And so that's where we've come today. So the study and sample demographics across these studies, study 1 had about 100 people, about half split between students with and without borderline features. Study 2 had 60 smokers, and study 3 had 92 chronic dieters. So in the table here, the superscripts with different letters show significant differences. So the student group was younger, the 2 student groups in study 1 were younger than the community samples. The smokers had a greater percentage of men. No differences in ethnicities, pretty predominantly white across all of the studies. And then the borderline features group had slightly lower response rates, reflecting a kind of greater kind of clinical nature of that group. Okay, so the procedures for these studies were fairly similar across studies, and all the pieces I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to highlight the similarities. So each participant came into an initial lab session, completed some individual difference measures and some lab-based tasks I'm not going to talk about here. They were then oriented to the LifeData phone app on either Android or iPhone, and they started 1 week of EMA when they left the lab. So this week of EMA, they did 7 prompts per day between 8:30 a.m. and 9:30 a.m. and 9:30 p.m. They had at least 45 minutes between sessions, and we counted a session if they completed it within 10 minutes of receiving the prompt. In addition to the random prompts, the smokers and dieters in studies 2 and 3 did event responses. So right when the smokers started smoking or finished smoking, basically at the time they smoked a cigarette, and when the eaters had food, whether it was a snack or a full meal, we asked them to initiate a prompt with the same set of questions that they had at the random prompt, plus a couple other ones I'm not going to talk about here. So we can actually look at, was willpower different when right before smoking or eating compared to at random times. They came in for a debrief a week later. So at every single prompt, participants completed measures of positive affect and negative affect, where they were basically asked how happy, how sad, how relaxed do you feel right now, from 0 to 6 scale. They completed a 3-item distress intolerance measure, which was developed for EMA by me and my lab group a couple of years ago. They completed measures of willpower, which I will show you in a second. They also completed measures of tiredness, craving uncontrollability for the smoking and dieting groups, and context. So we asked, where are you? Who are you with? Are you alone? Are you by yourself? Are you working? Are you having fun? Those kinds of things. And I should note that there was some variability in the specific items across the study. So the positive and negative adjectives were not the same across studies, but we did not have significant differences in measurement to suggest that the differences in the exact adjectives that were used actually contributed to the results. So I just want to be clear about that. There were also some differences in the willpower measure. So this was the willpower measure that we used. Study 1 which had the first two groups, the with and without borderline feature students, had 2 items. So right now I have blank willpower, where they saw a 0 to 6 scale. And number 2, if I had to do a task right now that required significant self-control, I would be successful at that task. The studies 2 and 3 had a 3rd item. If something tempting came across my path right now, I would have the strength to resist it. We initially had the 3rd item in the first study as well, but dropped it for time. And it became sort of a useful process actually to see if there were differences in kind of reliability or variability with the 2 or 3 item measure, and we really didn't find any differences. So the first question asked in the study was whether self-reported willpower does vary over time. So one of the ways we looked at that was using intra-class correlations, which address the degree of variability. So high inter-class correlations reflect greater between-person variability. So an intra-class correlation ranges from 0 to 1, and very high scores, 0.9, would suggest that there may be between-person differences. So if someone's high in self-control and someone's low, but people are basically stable within themselves over time, whereas low ICCs show that people are variable within themselves over time. And we see that the willpower item is acting pretty similarly actually to the affective items, with a little bit higher ICC in the sort of less clinical group, that the students without borderline features, which is our pseudo control group. We also see, as expected, sort of looking at the construct validity here, that people, when they report higher willpower, they report being less tired, or when they're less tired, they report higher willpower. So all of these analyses, just as a side note, were conducted using multi-level models in R to account for the nested data structure. So we looked a little bit at the smokers and dieters, at the context and craving, and found, as expected, that when people reported more lower craving, higher craving uncontrollability, when they felt like their craving was out of control, they also reported lower willpower. And we found that willpower was lower at the smoking and eating sessions. Remember, when participants completed these, they completed them, although maybe after starting, but it was a slight retrospective. So they were asked, when you started, before you started smoking, before you started eating, how did you feel? And so people reported significantly lower willpower before smoking and eating compared to at the random prompts. So our second question was whether willpower would be associated with emotion, and we found that it was. So in these models, negative and positive affect were entered simultaneously, and both were predictive of willpower. So when people felt more negative affect, when they felt worse, they also then felt lower willpower. When people felt better, they reported more willpower. And we had the same pattern of results across all 4 studies. So again, some sort of replication here. Now, interestingly, when we added distress intolerance into these models, so here we're looking at the relationship in that sort of last row of each section. When we're added distress intolerance into the model, when controlling for affect, we see a significant relationship between willpower and distress intolerance. When distress intolerance was higher, willpower was lower. And this essentially wiped out the effect of negative affect for all the studies except for the borderline feature students. So we're seeing that distress intolerance willpower relationship is kind of a little bit stronger than the affect one. It's wiping that out, which kind of makes sense since both of them are kind of self-efficacy variables. And then the last question was looking at lagged effects. So we thought that willpower would predict subsequent time distress intolerance. So here you see willpower at time 1, and we're going to predict distress intolerance at time 2, and we have both these set of 4 measures at each time point. So what we want to do is look at willpower at the prior session predicting distress intolerance. So time 2 distress intolerance is our outcome. And we're going to control for affect at the time distress intolerance was reported to kind of take out the affect and isolate the sense of intolerance that a person's experiencing. We're going to control also for the distress intolerance at the prior session to isolate that sort of willpower at the prior moment and how that's predicting distress intolerance. So in the results I'm going to show you on the next page, the top row, it sort of has like a little rectangle around it will show that willpower to distress intolerance relationship. And what we find here is that willpower at the previous session predicts distress intolerance at the subsequent session for all of the groups except our control group, our students without borderline features. This means for people who struggle with self-control, which are people with borderline features, smokers, and dieters, that willpower serves as a vulnerability factor for subsequent distress intolerance. Now, the reverse was not true. We did not find that distress intolerance predicted subsequent session willpower. So, remarkably, this never happens to me, that pretty much all the things we thought were going to happen actually happened in this study, that we found variation in willpower over time and across contexts. We saw willpower's associations with affect, sort of replicating the research done on momentary impulsivity. And we also found that lower willpower was associated with the sense of not being able to tolerate emotion, and we had a predictive effect for the clinical groups, borderline smokers and dieters, that willpower was a vulnerability factor to reporting less ability to tolerate distress in the subsequent session. So there were definitely some limitations to this study. Were willpower to have been the primary function of the study, I certainly would have included an individual difference measure getting at self-control. We didn't have that in these studies. To ask the question of whether trait willpower, trait self-control predicted lower momentary willpower or fluctuations in willpower. It could be that people with lower self-control see more of a yo-yo effect in their willpower over in the moment. And then we didn't assess some other contexts like the actual amount of sleep a person had, how hungry they were, life stressors, things like that. So there's some future directions I'd like to take with this work. One is explicitly comparing momentary willpower with momentary impulsivity. I would anticipate that these would be negatively associated, that people would feel more impulsivity when they have less willpower, but that they wouldn't be identical. I do think that willpower and impulsivity might have some different outcomes. Speaking of which, I would also then want to look at how momentary willpower actually corresponds to the choices that people make in their life. So some of the work that Will Hoffman has done, looking at desires and whether people gave in to their desires, would be very useful to look at alongside momentary willpower. So take-home points from this study, we do have some initial evidence that self-reported momentary willpower varies over time and has psychological meaning. There were three studies here with 4 different groups. We found pretty consistent patterns across those studies with some of these basic findings. And unsurprisingly, people feel less capable of self-control when their negative emotions are higher. There's been some work lately that suggests that emotion-related impulsivity or people's sort of lack of self-control in emotional states is maybe really important to understanding psychopathology. So I think this work could help lead some additional charges in that domain down the line. And particularly for people who struggle with self-control, emotions are really important, right? So this idea of emotion-related impulsivity for people who struggle with psychopathology, for people who struggle with eating, who struggle with substance use, who struggle with kind of generally personality, pathology, emotions, and interpersonal issues, that willpower and distress intolerance relationship, their self-perceptions of what they're capable of, may be particularly important for those groups. And I guess my last point is that momentary willpower is worth studying some more down the line. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Good talk. So I have several questions here for you.
Sure.
First one is particular for study 1 with college students. Could you talk a bit about research incentive? So how did you incentivize, and how did you go about recruiting your sample?
Sure. So they were incentivized with credit. So we have a subject pool here. So these were people from our subject pool. So they got 4 credits for doing that study, which their requirement is 8, and it's equivalent to about 1 hour per credit. So over the course of the lab sessions plus the week, they got 4 credits. So they were fairly well incentivized. In terms of recruitment, we recruited on the front end. We have a pre-screener. So we gave the PAI, the Personality Assessment Inventory, borderline subscale. which is a fairly well-validated measure of borderline features. The control group had scores, T-scores of 60 or below, so sort of within the normal range, maybe a little bit higher, and then all the way down to the bottom end of the scale. And the high borderline group had T-scores of 70 or above, which is similar to a clinical cutoff.
Okay, great, thank you. So this next one says, thank you for the great talk. Did you look at willpower assessed at random prompts in time, kind of in relation to timed next cigarette or dietary lapse?
Oh, so like, did willpower predict time to next cigarette?
Right.
So I didn't look at time yet. That's a great idea. People who smoke tend to smoke pretty consistently over time. So this study, I suppose I should note, the cigarette study had both regular smokers who smoke like a pack a day, as well as intermittent smokers who smoke kind of less often. So it might be interesting to look at how willpower like predicts cigarettes for the intermittent smokers in particular, who are less sort of habitual in how they smoke. That's a great idea. The eaters, we definitely found that willpower was associated with the sort of self-perception of loss of control eating. But I haven't looked at any of the time factors to see if willpower, like subsequent session, predicted loss of control eating in the following session. That's another good idea. And I'll go back to my data.
Okay, great, yeah. So it might be, this one says, it might be interesting to see if there is a diurnal pattern to willpower.
Yes.
So yeah, there's a thought.
Absolutely. I would expect that there would be, and that's partly when I'm going to try to do another study in the fall or the spring next year and try to actually, I have a sleep researcher colleague here at University of Arkansas, so to be able to look at some sleep related factors, because there may be sort of a day diurnal relationship, and also if somebody's napping in the middle of the day, that might sort of repletes or willpower. So there's almost certainly some patterns across time. You know, we didn't get eating unassociated with the random prompt. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we can get at to look at some of the other contextual features that people might be experiencing, as well as sort of waves over time. Great idea.
Yeah, it's just the kind of a power nap in the afternoon and all the benefits
Right.
around that. Is that restore willpower? Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So this next one, great presentation. Any thoughts on why low willpower failed to predict distress intolerance among the controls?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. So I don't know. It's without replicating that particular group in like a sample of other adults, or replicating it again, I don't know. But I do think that for some people, willpower and emotion are not quite as yoked together over time. So we did find that willpower was a vulnerability factor for distress intolerance for the clinical groups, and like maybe that's a hallmark of psychopathology. So that's what the emotion related impulsivity people think, is that they think that these people's sort of reactions to their emotions and perceptions, lack of self-efficacy, and tendencies to engage in avoidance and other types of self-control mishaps are the core of what undercuts a lot of psychopathology. So this is evidence that supports that perspective. For the people who don't have psychopathology, we're not seeing those sort of that yoked relationship between kind of people's perceptions of willpower and how they can manage their emotions. So I would hope to think that maybe that lack of relationship is maybe a sign of psychological health, but I don't know. I'd like to find that result again.
Yeah, no, interesting. I actually had a related question about that, about differences between groups, and the magnitude of fluctuation in willpower in relation to positive and negative affect. Have you looked at that a little bit, and maybe that might be an indicator of trait willpower, where the magnitude of fluctuation doesn't occur along with fluctuation in negative and positive affect. I don't know, thoughts about that? Have you looked into that?
I haven't looked at that yet. I do think that they would be very interesting to look at. So in some other studies that I've done, I've used sort of the mean square successive difference to look at kind of variability. And we didn't do that with these set of analyses, but I could do that looking at willpower. But how willpower and affect are yoked at the momentary level, and then how those might differentiate amongst people. I
Mhm.
haven't done that yet either, but that's interesting. Analytically, I don't know how to do that, but if I could figure it
Okay.
out, that's a good idea.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for a very interesting talk, Dr. Veilleux. Thank you so much. Thanks for the great questions. We are now at our next break. This one will be 20 minutes. So we'll have a 20-minute break now. So please try to make it back to your seats about 2 p.m. Eastern time for some announcements before our next speaker Matthew, Dr. Matthew Kirkpatrick. He'll be presenting on a new method in daily life research. And this is the use of dyadic yoking for triggering notifications. And definitely be sure to pick up your complimentary beverage on your way back to your seat. But please, again, one per person. We've had more people than we thought attend. So thank you for participating in the first Insights Conference, and enjoyed my time with you. I'll be handing off moderating duties to my colleague and good friend, Tim Steenberg. So we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you so much, everybody.